My grandmother completely destroyed my family. I hope this is the right decision. This is something I haven't told anyone, ever. And I know that makes me a shit person. I own a share of the blame, and I've accepted that. I'll state now that this will contain mentions of child abuse, alcoholism, and abuse in general. Maybe this will be cathartic for me, but more than anything, I hope it'll stop another grandmother from destroying a family and killing a man. My mom, she's a wonderful woman. She's fierce and protective, and she loves me. But sometimes I can see the broken parts of her underneath. Her mother, my grandmother, was just 15 when she got pregnant with my mother and was forced to marry my grandfather, who was 18. Like most shotgun weddings, my grandparents grew to loathe each other. My grandmother took this out on my mother, often threw things and beat her, yelled and cursed and drank. My aunt was born when my mother was 5, and although my grandfather raised her as his own, no one is entirely sure my aunt is my grandfather's child. Regardless, the abuse never happened to my aunt, but it continued for my mother until she outgrew my grandmother, and one day, when my grandmother went to slap my then 16-year-old mother, my mother threw a punch and clocked my grandmother in the jaw. She packed her stuff and moved out within an hour. My mother didn't go home for 5 years. There's a lot of other history in there that isn't super important to my story. So I'm going to fast forward to when my mother met my father, when she was 29. She lived about an hour away from her family. She had a now stable relationship with her mother, but her parents had by then separated and live in separate houses in the same street. My aunt was married, but had recently found out she couldn't have kids, and within the next year, her husband will leave her for a woman who can. My mother was now manager of a restaurant in the city she lived in. Every day, a man would sit to eat during the lunch hour rush. He'd take his time and loiter when my mother was covering for a waitress. He always sat in her area. My father was a truckie who often took routes that would land him in my mother's restaurant around lunchtime. I don't really remember him. From what I've been told, he was sarcastic and funny, and he loved making my mother laugh. He could wiggle his ears. He was a volunteer firefighter. He ate too much chocolate and got really loud when he was drunk. He loved golf, but he sucked at it. He was a good man. My parents were together a year and accidentally got pregnant with me, but they weren't unhappy. They got married when my mother was 3 months pregnant and built a house 2 hours away from my grandmother. My grandmother insisted that they visit often, especially after I was born. The fact that I was the first baby born into my mother's family in 30 years, so I am special, is something my grandmother reminds me often. My mother had quit her job before having me, but when I was 2 years old, she had to find work again. My grandmother came up to look after me. My aunt had moved back in with her because of her husband leaving her, so she would look after my grandmother's house. My grandmother took very good care of me. She'd changed since my mother's childhood. They didn't fight, and she didn't drink to the extent she used to since leaving my grandfather, and my parents trusted her. This went on for 2 years. And then my father's shifts changed so that he worked nights and my mother worked days, and so I'd always have a parent home. My grandmother would no longer be needed. And then, one night, when my father was working a night shift, I told my mother that my father had touched me that day where he wasn't supposed to. I told her it hurt. My grandmother had been in the room at the time, flipped out, and insisted my mother take me to the hospital. We went, and the doctors found no evidence of sexual abuse. But I told the doctors exactly what I'd told my mother, who stood in tears at my side. To this day, I can still see the heartbreak on her face. In 20 years since, the only time she's ever looked close to that crushed was when our dog was put down. My grandmother was sent back to the house to gather as many clothes and things as she could carry. My mother and I were to stay overnight in the hospital and then meet her at her house when the police were done with us. We never went back to our house again. I don't remember a lot of the next few months and years. Most of even what I've written so far is largely secondhand and bits and pieces of memories. But I know what happened next. My father was arrested and released on bail, and was ordered to not contact my mother or anyone in her family. My mother filed for divorce and moved us in with her mother, who let us stay rent-free. I was supposed to start kindy, but every time my mother left me with anyone but my grandparents or aunt, I screamed and bit and kicked and punched. In the months following, I became more volatile and angry. I wanted to see my father, demanded to see him, only to be slapped by my grandmother if we were alone. "He's a bad man. He's the devil, and he'll take you away from us if he sees you. Do you want that? Do you never want to see your mom again?" She'd scream and send me to my room. I never asked my mother if I could see him. A little while before my father's court date, he broke the court order and came to the front door of my grandmother's house. I answered the door, having seen him walking slowly up the driveway. I remember clinging to his jeans as my grandmother screeched and tried to pry me away. My mother came and managed to pull me back. There was a lot of screaming, my dad yelling that he would never ever do anything to hurt me or my mother. He didn't know why I said what I said, but he didn't hurt me. My mother was crying, screaming. She loved me more than anything. She would protect me even from him. She hated him, and he needed to leave, she said. My grandmother called the police, but my father left before they arrived, and all I can remember is screaming for him to come back. But he didn't. He went back to our home and killed himself. You've probably already guessed what had happened. My grandmother spent 2 years grooming me, pulling me around and telling me lies. I don't know how she made me say that my father hurt me. I wanted to make her happy, I think. I had loved her. I didn't know what my words would do. I don't know why she made me do it, but I have my theories. Perhaps she wanted me all to herself. Maybe she wanted my mother and I to live closer to her. Maybe it was just because she was jealous my mother found love. I can remember her saying, "You tell your mother what Daddy did." And when I asked her what he did, she'd get mad and sigh and tell me, "He touched you down there and it hurt." It has been 20 years since my father's death, but for a long time, I had no memory of what really had happened. I was put into counseling, and I think that helped me bury everything. I kept to the story. Eventually, I began to sort of believe it. My extreme behavior proved that something awful had happened to me, my psychiatrist said. My mother never doubted me for a second. I hate myself. I miss my dad, but I know it isn't entirely my fault. And that's why I'm writing here. It has helped, really, getting it all out on here and knowing someone might read it. Someone will know my father wasn't a bad man. He was a good man. I can't tell my mother, not now. She moved on eventually, remarried and had another daughter. My little sister thinks that my stepfather is my biological father. It's like my father was written out of history, and I hate that. I hate thinking about what could have been if my grandmother wasn't made of evil, if I had been stronger or smarter, or told the truth before things became unfixable. Update 1. It's been a while since I posted. A lot has happened. Although I didn't respond to anyone in the comments, I read them all and took your advice. I found a psychologist. We've been working through everything. It's been hard. The end goal was to be ready to tell my mother the truth and then cut ties with my grandmother. She will never be punished for her behavior more than losing me, but that is something I'm learning to live with. I felt ready. Anyway, Mum comes to the appointment, and my doc sits her down and explains that I have to say something, and it's important that she listen. I struggle with talking about myself or my feelings, but we'd written out what I'd wanted to say and practiced, so I just read what was basically a letter to my mum about everything. Basically the entire time my mother just sits there, silent. She tries to not cry, but she does. After a bit, I ask her if she's okay. Instead of answering, Mum asks me if I'm okay, and I say no. I told her that I had to remove my grandmother from my life. Mum said she wanted to confront her, but my doc said it would be better if we cut contact and wrote her a letter. Mum agreed, and we cried for a long time. It's weird, but I think she was happier. I think she'd held on to so much guilt over everything. We cried and hugged and went and got hot chocolate together at a place my parents used to go. It was really nice to be there and listen to her talk about him without that edge of hate in her voice. We didn't talk to my grandmother for a few days, but she was busy, so she didn't notice. We quietly told my stepfather, who looked totally upset too. We decided to tell my sister when we'd had time to just adjust to everything. She doesn't know that my stepdad isn't my biological father. She is on the spectrum as well, so we wanted to prepare in case she got too upset. My stepdad has been great. He bought me home a box of Lindt chocolate, because that's his way of saying pretty much anything close to emotional. But too soon my grandmother came over, like she often did. She only lives about 10 minutes drive away, so it's never been weird having her just drop by whenever she wanted. But as soon as she walked in, you could feel the tension. She's all bright and smiles. Imagine this posh old lady that pinches your cheeks. She goes in to hug me, and I tell her I'm not feeling well and try to scurry to my room, but Mum tells me to stay. And I just know what's going to happen. I stay. Mum gets maybe a sentence and a half in, something like, "Kay told me what you made her say," before my grandmother goes insane, screaming, screeching, trying to get around my mother and get to me. Kay's a liar. I would never do that. She's fucked in the head. She needs psychiatric help. I told you that doctor wasn't doing any good. It's a good half an hour of her screaming that she needs to take care of me. Me keeping out of her sharp nails, and Mum screaming at her to get out of the house before my stepfather comes home. And my grandmother suddenly composes herself enough for Mum to shove her out the door, slamming it in her face. She tried calling, texting. She even booted up her never-used Skype account to try getting a hold of us. My little sister had to be told sooner than we wanted, but she took it well. My stepfather answered her 3 a.m. call and told her simply if she called again, he'd ring the police. She didn't call again. Everything seemed okay for a few days. Mum went to my grandpa's house and talked to him. He wants to see me when I'm ready and sent his apology that his ex-wife could be so cruel. But Mum said he wasn't that surprised. She said that my grandmother had always been obsessed with me. She just didn't think it was a bad thing because her mother had never loved her. My aunt has totally blocked us, told my mother we're ungrateful cunts, but I knew that was likely going to happen. And then, a month, I get a Facebook message from her in the family chat no one ever uses, so we all forgot about. "You don't deserve a dog. It's gone." A few months ago, I bought a puppy. He got hit by a car in a freak accident, and my grandmother graciously offered to pay for the vet bills I otherwise would never have been able to afford. She loves animals, truly. She called him her grandpuppy. He made a full recovery, was totally unaffected. If you had told me then that 6 months later she would kill my dog to spite me, I would have thought you were insane. But that's what she did. With a police escort, my mother, stepfather, and I searched her house, her yard, nothing. She stood in her yard with the police arguing that the dog was hers because she paid for the vet bills, ECT. It didn't matter. He wasn't there. She rambled that I wasn't fit to look after myself. I was insane. I should be medicated. I was spreading lies about her, and my mother was encouraging my self-destructive behavior. It took everything I had to ignore her, but my stepdad had to put his very beefy arm around my mother to hold her with him. We still haven't found Murphy. I don't think we will. If she'd just let him out, he would have come home, or someone would have found him. She killed him. I know it. There's posters all over town. On Facebook, he's listed as stolen missing. I'm running out of room, so I'm gonna stop here, but this woman still hasn't stopped, and I feel so trapped, and so much worse than before. I should have just not said anything. Update 2. I got a few messages asking if I'm okay, if my dog Murphy was found. No and yes, but he wasn't okay. Basically, I fucked up. Really bad. My sister's high school graduation was a few days after I posted my last update. My parents and I went, but we all forgot my grandmother had bought tickets to go as well. But when we remembered on the way there, we were like, surely she won't come. But she was there. Alone, no grandfather, who is separated from her, but they normally do family things like this together, and no aunt. We'd had the police warn her to stay away from us. There was an ongoing investigation into Murphy going missing, but only because of the message she sent. She claimed it was a typo, but she hadn't come near us since we'd looked at her house to find him. I don't even fucking know why she thought she should come, but she is standing there waiting at the family door after my sister had gone with her class to line up. I couldn't go in there. My mom insisted we just tell her to fuck off and ignore her. This isn't about me, it's about my sister. I need to be strong for her. I tried. I didn't want her to ruin my sister's day. I walked behind my parents and they glared at her. She put her nose up at them, glared at me, but didn't say a word. She was talking to one of the teachers. We should have noticed it was one of my sister's teachers. She sat right behind me, tapping my chair with her foot like she wanted me to turn around and talk to her. For 2 hours I sat there and she tapped, and finally there was a break in the ceremony, and I spun around to tell her to fuck off, leave me alone, or I'd deck her. She was waiting for me. She had her phone out, pointed at me. If it had been higher, you'd have thought she was videoing the stage, but it was directly pointed at me. I didn't get it at first, and then I realized I'd been louder, and I sounded furious. I am a girl, but I'm 6'3", and I take boxing classes. I'm intimidating. And my 5'5" innocent, little old lady looking grandmother has a video of me telling her to fuck off, or I'd assault her for what probably looks like no reason. I felt like I was going to vomit, but my grandmother just made a tisk sound and asked me to speak to her nicely, like she was talking to a toddler. I turned back around and just sat there. My parents knew what had happened, but not about the tapping until later when I told them, so they had no idea why I reacted like that. I heard my grandmother talking later to the people next to her about how I'd recently had an episode and needed treatment to please forgive me for my language and behavior. The rest of the ceremony was uneventful. My sister graduated and we went home. I told my parents what happened. They were pissed and said they'd follow it up with the police on Monday. I need to skim over the next part. I cannot do much more than type what I know happened. I went to my room and Murphy was on my bed. He had been dead for a while. I remember screaming. My parents came in. Sometime later, the police arrived. No one at my house had called them. I was unwillingly placed on a psych hold. I was a danger to myself and others. I apparently threatened my grandmother's life in police presence. I don't remember doing that. Update 3. Last time I updated my family was packing up the house to move out of state. That didn't happen, because karma might be a long time coming, but sometimes it's worth the wait. What happened next, I wasn't around for, as I was hiding out between a few friends' places, and didn't find out until I was ready to hear it all. My dog, Murphy, was deemed a cruelty case and autopsied before he was cremated. He had been fed rat poison pellets mixed into dog food. It was a very particular kind of poison. My stepfather was adamant charges be filed. At first, the police were hesitant to do so, as my grandmother was in their ears long before my parents contacted them. But one officer who had been there when we'd searched for Murphy at my grandmother's place was convinced it was her. She'd shouted a lot about how it was her dog. She had a right to him at the time. The police convinced her to let them search her house. They found the same rat poison that was used on Murphy. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough for charges to be filed. But she was not arrested. My family was asked to give statements at the police station, including me, which was terrifying. The police were wonderful. I don't know if my mother spoke to them about what my grandmother had been doing, or if they heard from the cops that detained me when I found Murphy what had happened, or what. But they were great. When that was over, we went to get food at the marketplace, and who do we run into? My grandmother. I think she was following us, but my mum did point out she gets her hair done there a lot, so it wasn't surprising she was there. She hadn't seen me since my sister's graduation, since before Murphy, and there's this evil look in her eyes when she sees me. I don't know if it was there before, or if I just never noticed it, but I can't describe it as anything but pure evil. She was laughing when she asked, "Did you find your puppy dear?" My mother told her to fuck off, that we were going to make sure she rots in jail, that we were leaving, and she was never going to see us again. A restraining order is pretty straightforward when your grandmother slaps your mother in the face in front of an entire shopping center full of people. Mum had a nice big red mark on her cheek, but she says it was worth it. She knew exactly how to set my grandmother off. She was counting on the little old lady act and the, "Oh, it was just a slap, she was disrespecting me," cries she used to use when my mother was a kid. The following day, my stepfather installed security cameras all around the house. I was still at my friend's house, unable to go back home because I felt sick every time I thought of my room, and the fear of my grandmother or police turning up. My parents thought maybe they might not have to move, but my grandmother would sit in her car at the end of the street, and if someone left the house, she would follow. When my parents called the police, she was always either gone or outside the RO area. She was warned, but upped her game to hiding somewhere we couldn't see and still following in the car. When the police warned her again, my aunt took over following us. My parents resumed packing, since they also felt uneasy in the house so close to my grandmother and aunt. They decided to move closer to my stepfather's family, who are as wonderful as he is. They live a few hours away in the same state. I was hesitant but wanted to make my family happy. I still feel guilty for causing everything to explode. My sister is very close to our cousins. They play online together almost every night, and she was excited to live near them. That following weekend, my stepdad's family turned up to help us pack and move. My stepuncle owns a car and truck rental company, so that was great. My aunt did a drive-by that day, which was also my first day back at the house to help pack. She stopped, took a photo from her window and drove off before my family could stop her. I had a panic attack, but nothing happened. I stayed inside just in case. I need to talk quickly about my aunt. She's had a shit life, and she has always been crazy, for lack of a better word. She had a breakdown after her first husband left her, and she lived with her mother on and off between sporadic partners that would leave just as quickly as they came. Her current partner of 4 years, a lazy but kind man, suffered a stroke while I was in therapy, but before I told my mother about everything, the family, grandmother included, attempted to support her while she drove 2 hours each way from the hospital and back. We took turns to stay with her while she slept, made her food, and cleaned her house. About 3 weeks after the stroke, she told everyone to leave her alone. So, we did. We were very close when I was a kid, but my mum and her always butted heads because mum would never let her just get her way. My aunt is the queen of temper tantrums, and as I grew up, I got sick of her erratic and abusive behavior. I could rant about her for pages and pages, but this isn't just no auntie. With that in mind, a few weeks after the public incident, my aunt unblocked me and sent me this at 3 a.m. on Facebook. I've cut it down to the worst. It was long and rambly. I've edited out names. I left the spelling and grammar errors in, including where she refers to my dad, not stepdad, as a her. What did we talk about, honey hun? Such a long time ago. Not having a dig, I just don't remember. So much has happened since then. Partner nearly dying, but no phone calls from my loving family to see how he was or I was. He was an inch away from dying or being a vegetable. Would I do that to you or your sister? When my bio dad died, I made sure you knew that because grandmother and your mother hated her so much, you could always talk to me if you needed someone. I would always be here no matter what, because they were so bitter and hateful and spiteful. Just like your mother is being to me no, when I actually thought we were finally getting back on track. I know this sounds like an attack, but it's not. It's me finally telling you how hurt I am, that I just don't exist in your thoughts, and now because of your shameful, disgusting mother, I never will be part of your lives. The world does not evolve around her. Well, not in the real world. Your mother is dead to me forever. There will never be any coming back after what she purposely did to grandmother. She's all tucked in with stepfather's family. The bitch has a black soul and an evil heart, and I never will say her name again or admit we are related. Mum's grandfather, who she was very, very close with but has passed on, must be totally ashamed. Goodbye. Kay, I will love you till my last breath, but I will not put you in the middle of this shit. So I will lose you are well. I screenshotted and then blocked her. We were gone the next day. Only my friends know where I've gone, and they know the whole story, and they will never tell anyone. My grandfather, bless him, said he didn't want to know where we were going. He met us on the way out of town. He surprised us with a huge amount of money, his savings that we would have inherited when he died. He has been making plans to move into a retirement village, and we promised to visit him when he's not living near my grandmother anymore. He wants to get away from her now that we're not a reason to stay. I love him, and I hope I can have a real relationship with him again. So we moved. Things were great. We found a property 10 minutes away from our cousins and their kids. We got sporadic updates from the police in our old town, but they weren't sure if they could do much more. Our Christmas was big and loud with stepfamily, and I felt happy, and I think Mum did too. And then our old neighbor rang. Our old house had been set on fireboxing day-night. Remember those cameras my stepdad installed? Before we'd moved, he'd had a feeling. He went and talked to our neighbor, and they set up the cameras to feed into our neighbor's computer and set up a few outside of his house. He didn't tell Mum or me because he didn't want us to be paranoid, but it was worth it. We won't be hearing from my aunt or grandmother for a long, long time. I found a new doctor, and I've been trying some new meds. And although sometimes I feel like shit, things actually look colorful again. I have a job interview on Monday. My stepdad found a job right away. Mum is still looking, but with my grandfather's money, things don't seem so impossible anymore. I'm thinking about trying out uni next year, something I never thought I would be able to do. I'll never forgive my grandmother, and I'll never forget Murphy. He was a special little guy, and there is no replacing him. A few weeks ago, I stumbled across another special boy. Diego's adoption tag was that he has so much love to give, and it has been so true. He has special needs, and needs a lot of love and care, but I think he knows we need each other.